This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
Significant and protracted
political theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. The DOX Documentary Film Festival kicks off its second full festival this month, showcasing a diverse slate of nonfiction stories for a hungry audience in the nation's capital. From politics, of course, to fashion, health, movie stars, a space program, there's a little bit of everything to choose from. There's also a very interesting constellation of films that concern aspects of the fallout from the 2020 election and the riot on January 6, 2021, that sought to overturn the election results. We're going to discuss that and more with Skye Sitney, co-founder of DOX and a professor at Georgetown University's Film and Media Studies program. Skye, welcome back to Political Theater.
Thank you, Jason. It's so fantastic to be here.
I believe that we did this last year around the same time, and of course we've been on the same sort of like, you know, in the same circles, documentary films dating back to Silver Docs when you were the festival director there.
Yes.
I think the first year I volunteered was 2006, and that was when, you know, in Silver Spring, and you know, there's this big build out with a lounge and all that kind of stuff, and like Jim Jarmusch was there, I think.
Oh yes,
like
yes.
Al Gore, you know,
exactly. That was quite the year. Yes, Jim Jarmusch was interviewing Martin Scorsese. So we share some great memories.
Yeah, it's and that has led to here, you know, where I think, you know, of course we both used to have very good memories of Silver Docs, but you know, the AFI moved the film festival to DC a few years back, and then you know, just put it on hiatus, you know, for different reasons, and it felt, you know, that there was a gap there, that there always should be. I mean, of all places, DC. I mean, I know that there are great documentary film festivals all across the country, but this, it seems like a very like appropriate place to sort of lift up nonfiction film in a place like DC, where we have so much media, we have so much politics, we have so much history.
Absolutely. I mean, that was very much our instinct, and I think it's been proven correct. There is an incredible hunger from filmmakers across not just the nation, but even, you know, internationally, to have their films play in this city, where, you know, what's interesting is that one might assume by virtue of that all films in the festival are explicitly political. And that's not quite the case, although I think we're going to focus quite a bit on some of those political films. But DC is a very important kind of fertile ground for this kind of cinema, and we're thrilled, you know.
Your showcase film is about Christopher Reeve, super slash man. There's a lot of slashes. DC Docs, you know, Superman. Just as an example, I mean, like we're going to talk about politics because that's the podcast, and you know, our focus on roll call. But I mean, if you know, again, I mentioned fashion. You got a Diane Furstenberg, you know, documentary.
Exactly.
There's one about Swamp Dogg for those who are into a kind of avant-garde music called Swamp Dogg Gets His Pool Painted.
Yes.
I'm very much looking forward to.
It's fabulous. It's a fabulous film.
But and this has grown too. I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started. I mean, this is the second full year. Last year you had a full slate, including the documentary about Joan Baez, which was again one of my great memories coming away from last year's festival. Was Joan Baez after midnight dancing at Dirty Habit, you know, at the Hotel Monaco where the after party was, barefoot.
That's right.
teaching the youngins, you know, how to get down.
Exactly. She pulled a little radio out of her purse to play the Gypsy Kings, threw off her shoes, and started a dance party. You can't ask for better than that. You know, she really set the tone for what this festival is.
Yeah, it was pretty great.
Yeah.
And now, so, you know, in 2022, you had a sort of a small slate where you were kind of announcing this is coming. Last year we had the full festival. That's right. This year you have almost 100 movies. I mean,
not almost. Yeah, explicitly. We actually have 100. Literally 100. Okay. Plus panels and workshops and a performance.
Right.
We're a little insatiable. It's dangerous. There's just so much good work out there, and it's hard to know where to stop. But yes, it's a sizable bit of growth.
It is, and we've got a little over 50 features, and then shorts, and even an episodic series. Yes. So there is a little bit. I mean, if shorts are people's things, like there's like, and they're all over the downtown area, the Burke Theater and Landmark, East Street Theater and so forth. But I mean, again, getting back to the political, I feel like I want to talk a little bit about, I notice as I'm going through, and also caveat, I am not an uninterested party in how this thing goes. I'm going to be moderating a Q&A after America's Burning with David Smick. This is based on Smick's book about economic inequality and how it leads to political unrest. Timely.
Yes.
This is directed, written by Smick, of course, the New York Times bestselling author, and then executive produced by Michael Douglas and Barry Levinson. So
that's right.
So again, I'll be moderating that panel, but I specifically, I mean, January 6th it seems to be almost like a mini theme with some of it, and in angles that are some that we haven't seen before. I mean, I did a podcast with on the 6th with the filmmakers, which is about January 6th and has a an on the ground feel, from body camera footage and so forth, that is very much that day through the eyes of several people who experienced it. But then you've got, this a short film, Denial, which again feels very targeted towards me because it's about Arizona. It's about the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors who, sort of fought against disinformation and in the wake of 2020 and certified the Arizona results. You've got Public Defender, about a public defender here in DC. And again, more caveats. My wife, Fawn Johnson, will be moderating the panel after that film.
Fantastic.
And but this is about a public defender who is defending two of the accused rioters on January 6th. And then you got War Game, which is kind of an interesting like hybrid, where you have several former and current, policymakers, influential political figures going through sort of an exercise of what would happen in a more extensive January 6th that has started to spread, which again is kind of terrifying because, when I don't know about you, but when I saw Civil War this year, I thought like, how far away are we from that? I mean, that's a fictional film. This is more, a documentary that uses fictional exercises to tell the story. But talk a little bit about the decision-making process that you and Jamie Shore, the other co-founder, and several of the people who were programming the festival made in assembling this slate. And did that happen sort of organically? Did you know you wanted some January 6th type or adjacent stories, or did it just sort of move that way independently?
Having been in this space that is film festival programming for nearly my entire career, and certainly well over a couple of decades, I feel very strongly that it is not my job as a festival director to anticipate and to proactively seek out content that fulfills some kind of interest or curiosity that I have, but to really go in open to the work that is out there and to respond to that. And so it was not intentional to have this slate of films that's dealing with, as you, I think, so rightly say, kind of both the reality of January 6th, its potential aftermath, and I say potential in the kind of war game scenario where we're kind of anticipating a potential trajectory. That being said, I think it's really important to listen very carefully, to look very carefully at what is being communicated to you through the work. So when one of the programs, you're programming both film by film on a case by case basis, and then you're also taking this 30,000 foot view and looking at what the kind of unexpected dialogue is between these works. And there is a really fascinating conversation that's happening between all these. In fact, even just looking at The Sixth and Public Defender, which are probably the two films that are most explicitly about January 6th, which are taking two very interesting views. One kind of embedded with the people who were impacted by the riot, as you put it, or the insurrection, as others might call it, and with public defenders, the people who actually participated actively in the riot. But it takes, I think, quite extraordinary view through the lens of the public defender, a, a real determination to build empathy, to understand rather than to judge. Literally, because that is the role, that is the oath that this particular public defender has taken, to defend. And so through the journey of that public defender, we come to have some time to try to understand the mindset, the education that brought two people in particular to this moment in their lives where they, quite frankly, believed they were doing the right thing. And I think that, and so we get this kind of extraordinary 360-degree view between these two films of this experience from people on the ground, presumably representing profoundly different positions. But I think in some ways what these films are trying to do, and in some ways what America's Burning is trying to do, is to suggest that this notion that we're so divided is in some ways strategic. It's a way of distracting us, civilians, from bigger problems. And if we're divided and we put all of our energy towards thinking about how different we are, we don't actually get to look at the big picture of how of bigger issues, kind of the corporate overreach in our economy, things of that nature. So there is this, again, like, not to be too wordy, and I'll wrap it up here, but this really interesting cross dialogue that's happening between these films, but all of them are offering different lenses and different perspectives, to explore it.
Yeah, and by the way, never worry about being wordy on this podcast.
Okay, all right.
Because you heard my just intro. It takes probably 3 times as long. So
right.
but,
okay,
but yeah,
good.
don't worry about that. No, I like the way you said that, because I also feel like sometimes as an editor at Roll Call, that I try to not anticipate, not to direct things so much that we lose track of not just what's happening in front of us. I mean, it's hard enough to keep up with news as it happens, but that we're also paying attention to the issues that are leading into the news, that can explain what is happening around the news. And I can't help but think, especially when you've got a film like Public Defender, that this is a movie that talks about the role of the integrity of the court system at a time when that's being challenged by the presumptive nominee of one of the major political parties, Donald Trump, who is actively sowing doubts about the inherent fairness of the judicial system. And that that is the kind of thing that is has a far-reaching effect. When people have asked me, well, what do you think is going to happen with the verdict, and the answer is I don't know, but I know one thing: if the effect 5 years down the line is that fewer people have faith that they can get a fair trial in America, that's a far more damaging set of circumstances than just one person's trial. And so I'm glad that you're getting that. And also, public defenders, they have to eat so much shit, on a daily basis. I'm so glad that you're showcasing, somebody who's like, I'm just trying to do my job. And this is, under the best circumstances, being a public defender is a difficult job, whether you're in Cottonwood, Arizona, or Washington, D.C.
Right.
And I just can't imagine.
So
I mean, the D.C. court system has this has defined it over the last few years, this set of cases. So.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the things I love about being able to bring these films together is not only the opportunity to see these incredible protagonists on screen, but to welcome them in person, for extensive Q&As. And in this case, Heather Shaner, the public defender, as well as, I believe, 2 of the defendants will be there. And this is true for most of the films, across the board. But it is really interesting. Obviously, when Andrea Kalin set out to make this film, I don't think she could have anticipated the current state that we're in right now with the 34, the particular moment in the judicial system, which is on all of our minds. But that's also kind of what's fascinating about this work, that it continues to resonate in different ways and have repercussions further down the line from when the moment they were made, the films were made.
There's also, I was thinking as I'm kind of going through the slate of films, it's intimidating because there's the one, that I'm responsible for sounding like I know what I'm talking about, right? With America's Burning, but also like there's the ones that I just want to watch, for my own edification, and I almost felt like it was like you've almost structured it like a newspaper where you've got the front page, right? You've got the entry point for several people, whether they want to watch a movie about Christopher Reeve or something about January 6th. You've got the almost a local section, right? Like the 51st state,
yes,
which is about a young activist, pushing for DC statehood. Is that could be in the local section?
Yes, exactly, exactly.
And then there's a style section. There's even a sports, and it gives people the ability to pick and choose. Again, it's a cliche that people are like, oh, nonfiction films, documentary films are all these sad things about this depressing event in history. And yes, there is a place for some of those heavy movies, but there's also there's some real quirk in this slate as well.
Very true, very true. When at the time that Silver Docs began, and I was there in its third year, this was at a period, this is, more than 20 years ago, when documentary itself was very peripheral, when, very few documentaries ever saw the light of day in a movie theater. It was pre-streaming platforms where there were, endless opportunities to see nonfiction. And at the time, it was quite almost remarkable that there could be an entire festival dedicated to documentary. And of course, the growth of that festival and many other documentary festivals that came around has mirrored the growth and interest and the way that documentary has just become at this point a very dominant, very important and uncontested part of the film ecosystem. So for me, what I like about the breadth and scope of our program is to continue to demonstrate how rich and robust and dynamic this form is. I'm often asked, if there's a very specific theme for the festival. And I think that would betray the goals of what we're trying to do, which is to say that documentary has so much capacity to be so many different things in not a way that's diluting its value, but actually expressing how thrilling and exciting this form is. And it can be everything from a purely animated documentary, which 10 years ago would have been inconceivable. The idea that something that's purely representational could also be understood as having documentary value and being in the realm of nonfiction, to films that are what we might call verite, highly observational, to hard-hitting investigative works that are interview heavy. The form has become so dynamic. And even now with AI, for better and for worse, there's some really interesting things happening. Filmmakers in the best possible ways are using it in very innovative ways, such as Eno, the documentary about Brian Eno, which is not at our festival, although the editor will be at our festival to talk about editing. This is a film that is never able to be repeated. It's using generative AI to create a brand new random or not so random edit each time one sees it. Two, using AI to protect identities of vulnerable protagonists who, for whatever the reason may be. For example, one of the films in our lineup called One South, Portrait of a Psych Unit, uses AI to mask in a very subtle way the identities of the young people who are in this institution. So I just think that it's very exciting to have a program, that can reflect all of the incredible artistry and journalistic integrity of this form, and to not limit it.
Yeah, and I'm curious, what you like. What are some of the things that you learned from the time that you made the announcement that you and Jamie said, like, we're doing this? Here's a few films. Here's a taste of what we'll offer soon. To last year's festival, to this year's festival. What things happened in there? Because in 2022 we were barely cognizant of generative AI.
Yeah.
And now this is literally, all anybody seems to talk about in terms of like how a business is run, or journalism, or filmmaking. Like this was a big part of the Screen Actors Guild strike. Is making
Absolutely.
sure that AI didn't appropriate things in inappropriately. Voices and images and likenesses and so forth. Scarlett Johansson got into it with
Oh, yeah.
Open AI for them using a very Scarlett Johansson-y voice
Right.
in their one of their latest
Right.
ChatGPT launches. So what are some of the things that you have had to incorporate or learn or change direction in from the time that this started to get off the ground to now?
Right. Yeah, I love the question, and I'm going to answer it. I'm not going to deflect it, but I think the first truthful answer is that I am not the expert on these micro kind of impacts. But what I am finding is that I'm kind of able to be a fly on the wall, or maybe more than that, kind of a quiet person in the conversation, listening closely to what I'm seeing the field experience, and creating opportunities at DC Docs to have these conversations. So, for example, we are going to be having a panel on the archive. And one of the key through lines of that conversation is the impact of AI in archival material, both in terms of creating extraordinary efficiencies and really getting us out of being able to identify and log and bring forward and make public much, hundreds of thousands, millions of hours of footage that's kind of just dormant because there's not enough literal man, woman power to log it all. Two, the danger of how easy it is to replicate what looks like archival material, and the kind of inability to verify, the truth of this material, and the danger of that. I also mentioned already the Eno example. We're going to be looking at that through a particular panel that's inspired by the New York Times's Anatomy of a Scene, where different film crafts people kind of look at something. So what am I seeing? I mean, there's a lot of anxiety in the documentary community right now. That's across a lot of different categories. First and foremost, just the sustainability of the field. There are certain institutions and entities that seemed impenetrable and seemed invulnerable have actually proven to be very, very vulnerable in this moment, such as, Sundance, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Participant that, a beloved institution that's very quickly, to everyone's surprise, closed down. There's all people can talk about is the quote unquote crisis of distribution. And that's kind of where Sundance comes to play, that one assumed that at the very least, if they could have this extraordinary opportunity to premiere at such a place that everything else rolled happily and healthfully forward, such as getting picked up, and the fact that only a few films were picked up out of Sundance over the past couple of years has created a chilling effect for the entire community, even funders. So I think that there's a tremendous sense of not really knowing where the industry is going. What I have found so fascinating is a film festival is very much a part of this ecosystem. We very much are the whole distribution landscape deeply interplays with the purpose and value and formation of a film festival. What I have found is that in some ways a film festival seems old-fashioned. We're a relic of the past. I mean, film festivals go all the way back to the days of Mussolini, who literally created the very first film festival with the Venice Film Festival. And, to highlight phenomenal Italian cinema. And at the same time, I am finding, and maybe I'm biased, I'm surely biased, that it is the energy and enthusiasm and desire that I'm seeing amongst the entire industry, filmmakers, distributors, audiences, to want to come together in person around film, to watch films collectively, to discuss them, to be in the hallway between films, to talk about them. I have felt this incredible enthusiasm for that. And again, that might seem old-fashioned. And I am finding that in a moment where distribution and kind of streaming and the theatrical is very much in flux, that a festival feels even more powerful and important and valuable. And again, that may be because that's the space I'm in, and that's what I'm experiencing. But in general, I think I think that people are concerned about the field, about its sustainability, about distribution, about audiences, about attention spans, about, especially in nonfiction, the capacity to verify truth claims, about there's a tremendous amount happening in this in terms of accountability. For many, many years now, there have been a number of organizations working very hard to create best practices for filmmakers working with vulnerable subjects, now known as participants or protagonists. And there has been some complicated things happening in the field recently. There's a lot of controversy around one filmmaker, Matthew Heineman, and one of the protagonists from his film Retrograde was killed by the Taliban. And it was pretty clear that the identity was revealed through that film, despite warnings to protect the identity. And this has kind of become a powder keg moment in terms of how filmmakers need to be accountable to the protagonists whose lives they're telling on screen. So that's another kind of thing that people are talking about a lot in this space.
No, I mean that the news about Retrograde, hit me kind of hard because Matt has been on this podcast several times for his movies dating back to Cartel Land, and he's I can't imagine what's going through his mind because he's this guy who goes into these war zones and very compromised situations and gets the story, but he's also very sensitive. This is my read on him in limited interactions, but over a 10 to 15 year period of time now, is that I can't imagine what he is going through with this. And it speaks to a larger question of like, how are people protected in situations like that, where, talk about a chaotic situation. Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is what Retrograde concerns.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. How do you get all the permission slips in? So, or how can you anticipate, what some of the, problems will be, because we didn't know what the effect would be of, the Taliban, what would they do after the United States withdrew? It's
right. Absolutely.
It's really rough. Yeah.
It's very complex. And I think that's, you're reminding me of two things. One, I do want to flag another film in the lineup that I think is a really interesting, fascinating
Hollywood Gate.
Look, Hollywood Gate. Yes. Utterly, utterly riveting. So we'll come to that in a second. But I do, I think that this question is also a space, an interesting gap in the space between filmmakers, people who really define themselves as documentary filmmakers, and journalists. And I think more and more, many documentary filmmakers are adopting or forced to adopt certain kinds of practices that are embedded in the journalism field, extensive fact checking, among many, many other kinds of things. But in general, this doesn't really exist in documentary filmmaking. If there's an and I'm no longer specifically talking about Matt and Retrograde, just generally, unless a filmmaker is working with a particular institution, let's say, New Yorker or Field of Vision, or who knows, it's not necessarily required that they are following a particular kind of code of ethics or best practices that would be expected within the journalism field. I do think that many filmmakers are increasingly forced to or choosing to go adapt those kinds of processes. But this has been something that's come up in the field because many filmmakers are, in fact, occupying the space that would be traditionally understood as the work of a journalist. But without the training, without the protection, legally, bodily, digitally, you name it, and sometimes without the kind of expectation of a particular code of practice and ethical model.
Yeah, I ran into this with another person who I've had on the podcast a couple of times and have interviewed several times, dating back almost 20 years. It's Kirby Dick, no relation to me, but he's a really terrific documentary filmmaker. And I think the first movie that I talked to him about that he made was called This Film Is Not Rated, which was about the ratings board, the MPA it was the MPAA at the time. Now it's just the
Yes.
MPA,
Yes.
Motion Picture Association. And then, you know, he started picking up much, you know, more high profile kind of assignments, including about sexual assault in the military. And I asked him at one point, you know, do you consider yourself a journalist? Because a lot of these projects, even though documentaries aren't going to get the same kind of attention as, say, the latest Spider-Man movie, I mean, it does provide a platform where people can understand a very complex issue outside of the confines of journalism, of a newspaper or a site or so forth. Do you consider yourself a journalist? And he said, absolutely not. I'm not a journalist. But I also saw that he did adhere very, you know, he seemed to adhere very stringently to, you know, protecting people who, you know, need to be protected, exposing people who do need to be exposed, you know, the sort of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, rubric that we as journalists tend to adopt. But it is this question as it becomes more, as we go into more areas in journalism, you know, or in documentary films that are like long-term journalism projects, if people are going to continue to be cognizant of some of the issues that are inherently important to adhere to. So
that's right.
And you were worried about being wordy. That's the wordiest thing I've said in years.
No, not at all. It didn't sound wordy to me.
Well, before we sign off, I'm curious. Like I have a few films that stick out to me from the past, from, you know, sort of classic documentaries that still mean a lot to me. And I won't go like super extensively, but they're things that were either a true pleasure to watch or just really piqued my interest at the time that I saw them, or resonate still with and pushed boundaries. And so I wanted to mention a few of mine, and I'm curious to give you the platform to talk about some of your favorites. And again, this doesn't have to be any particular order of things, just things that are important to you. Which I know is difficult for somebody who is a film professor.
Right. There's so many.
Yeah, if your students are going to listen to this, like, well, so why did we have to watch this if you didn't mention this?
Such a good point.
One of the first ones that occurred to me, you know, as an undergraduate that I just absolutely loved was The War Room, about the Clinton campaign, but specifically about George Stephanopoulos and James Carville, and just how
such a great film.
Yeah, incredible that is. And again, I was a political science major, so, you know, not a surprise that movie appealed to me. A couple of music oriented ones, which I'm Don't Look Back, which is just, again,
so fabulous.
Just you know, the you can see the effect in music videos for 30, 40, 50 years afterward, just coming from that particular.
So true. It's such an influence.
Speaking of music, The Last Waltz, you know, I just, every time I watch it, I you know, I think about how much I love the band, and how much I love that way of portraying that. And also just think about like how great it would actually have been to have seen live, or like in that movie, a performance of The Wait, because the sound failed or whatever, they had to go back and record it in the studio. I mentioned Cartel Land. It still stands. I mean, I felt like I was, even though I was talking to Matt a year or so after he made that movie, I was still afraid for his safety. Watching the movie. With you.
Yes.
And then finally, The Act of Killing, about the massacres in the 1960s in Indonesia, and people, you know, reenacting them, you know, talk about a sort of a genre pushing documentary.
Absolutely.
So what are some of yours?
Well, I love that. It's great that you ended with The Act of Killing, because that is actually a very important film for me to teach. And I always teach it at the end of a documentary class. We kind of build ourselves up to be able to understand how to put this film in context. You know, The Act of Killing, like a number of critical films before it, including Errol Morris's Thin Blue Line, and Errol Morris, of course, is an executive producer of The Act of Killing, does does something it's a kind of film that the entire documentary community spent a year or two, like The Thin Blue Line, saying, is this a documentary?
Right.
Can we, how do we incorporate this into into our metabolism, into what we believe to be a documentary? And then years later, it's uncontested.
Right.
So what's fascinating about the film is this idea that if you have people kind of perform themselves, perform their past, that there is something new that can be discovered in this. The film professor is coming out now because I'm seeing connections with that, and Showa, Cloud Landsman kind of did this as well. So everything I've just said is probably indecipherable. I'm sorry to our audience. For me, I think there's a number of films that are very important to me. Both, they may or may not be pleasurable to watch, but they feel very, very important. Number one, I'm an enormous fan of Frederick Wiseman's body of work. Mm-hmm. The fact that most of his films are, many hours long, easily 3 hours long, and at least the vast majority of his career, over 40 years, was examining different kinds of American institutions, whether it be welfare or
the staff at Madison Square Garden.
Exactly. That's the one that never came out, though.
Right.
For legal reasons, that one's never been able to be seen. A film called Near Death about the ICU in a Boston hospital. Primate, about scientific testing on animals. I love the way in which he, or domestic violence, focuses on a particular kind of institution, and we see it through the lens of everyone who kind of touches that institution. I find it very, very fascinating. I appreciate the patience. I appreciate the commitment to that observational mode. I also love another film that you probably would only see in film school, is Chantal Akerman's News from Home, which is very experimental and largely still images of, by that I mean the camera is on a tripod, documenting quiet spaces in New York from the 1970s, while we occasionally hear letters that her mother back in Brussels wrote the young Chantal Akerman, who's now in New York, worrying endlessly about how her daughter's doing. We hear Chantal read the letters, but we never hear the response. And in many ways, the response is this film, which is lonely and alienating and filled with so much space and room for an audience to just kind of lose themselves in a moment. So I think I tend to like films that create a tremendous amount of space for the audience to kind of put some pieces together and to do a little bit of work on it. Of course, love Grey Gardens, the antithesis of this. Just the deals are so delightful and interesting. But yeah, it's just, there's so many films that are incredibly important, and there's just so many wonderful contemporary filmmakers doing incredible work.
When I was going through my notes to get, and again, I could come up with a more a broader list too, but then I was looking at I catalog all the films I watch, on a,
that's smart,
and there are so many movies that I own. Even I have them on Blu-ray or DVD, like say from the Criterion collection, like Shadows and Fog, that I still haven't watched. I still haven't watched so many of these movies. And when for more casual film fans, they might think like, you're insane. You have like all your house is basically like wallpapered with DVDs and discs and so forth. And then on the other hand, the people who are really into film are saying like, how could you have not seen like The Sorrow and the Pity, or how could you have not seen like something like that? But there's again or Harlan County, USA, or something like that. So I think that there is so much out there, and that's also what kind of keeps me going, and which is why I'm glad to be able to talk to you on a consistent basis, and also be even just a small part of talking about films and nonfiction films and why they're so important and why they're so interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we look forward to welcoming you to the next edition.
Yes, and just to give a time frame for our listeners, this starts on June 13th, which is coming up a little over a week from when this podcast publishes, and it will go through the 16th Sunday night. And it's here. It's if you go to there's a full schedule, you can slice and dice and go according to your interests, and whether you want to see short films or long films or films about politics or films about LGBTQ issues. I mean, it's all sort of there, and good luck on it. It will be full. I know you're very busy, so thank you for taking the time.
Oh, it's absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you and hopefully your listeners at DC Docs.
Awesome. Thanks, Guy.
Okay, take care. Bye.